And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hey, hello. I'm Greg, and this is Lynn McDonald. And we are so excited to welcome you to the first Embracing the Journey speaker series. It is great to have you here, and we're thrilled that you chose to invest your evening with us. We've got a really great evening in store. And excuse me. I'd like to just start by for those of you who are not real familiar with Embracing the Journey, the long and short is what we do at Embracing the Journey is we build bridges. We build bridges between LGBTQ plus individuals, their families, and the church, even when they seem at odds. And we do that not in spite of the Bible, but because of the Bible. So when we created the speaker series, it was specifically for the intent of helping inform the parents that we work with and those who we haven't met, but people who are on this journey. We really believe that information is power, and helping you to become informed better equips you to not only love your child well, but to lean into your faith at the same time, which we just think is super important. You'll find that with our speaker series that we're going to have speakers, some that lean a bit to the left, some that lean a bit to the right. And that's something that we're actually very intentional about. We think it's important to hear from people, if you will, on both sides of the conversation, both sides of the debate. And because it's for us, it's not about telling people what to do or what to believe. We really believe the Holy Spirit is more than capable of that. But again, informing folks is just it's a real passion of ours. So we're super excited to kick this off. Right now, by the way, you're joined. You can't see it with the webinar format, and this is really our first webinar format. So if we look a little clumsy, we are. It's our first, and but there's over 500 other individuals with us on the call this evening, and those people, those 500 individuals, represent 42 states and 8 countries. So you're in good company. Sometimes Satan would have you believe that what is happening in your life is unique to you, and we would tell you it is not at all unique. Excuse me. So helping answer questions tonight, we have Kat Tyndall, who's with us. Hey, Kat. And Kat is a board member of Embracing the Journey. We also have Melanie Vadsminsk. Melanie V.
Melanie V. We just call her Melanie V.
Anyways, Melanie is our Director of Operations and Client Experience. And so the two of them will be sorting your questions. The Q&A feature has been turned on, so you'll be able to ask substantive questions. And our intent is that Mark will spend roughly half the evening sharing with us and the other half doing Q&A. And with that, Melanie, I'd like to hand it over to you. I know you've got a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll get moving.
Yes, thanks everybody for joining us. So glad you could be here. So as Greg said, we are using the Zoom webinar format. And so we cannot see you, and you can see us that are on the panel. And so we have complete anonymity this evening. And but we do have the Q&A function active at the bottom of your screen. And so if you have questions for Dr. Yarhouse, as he said, Kat Tyndall and I will be monitoring those questions. And when it gets to the Q&A session, we'll be able to present those to Dr. Yarhouse. So we really, really appreciate your participation. And then the other thing that I just wanted to point out is that we will be sending out a survey tomorrow. So if you can take the time to do that survey for us, it would be really helpful for us as we shape our future events. So thank you all for being here. Welcome. And I'm going to send it back to Greg now.
Perfect. Hey, let me just open with a word of prayer. God, thank you so much for being our God. Lord, we are grateful for things like technology that allow us to gather literally around the world. And we're thankful for Mark joining us this evening. And we just pray that you would give him great wisdom. We pray that you would give us ears to hear, that you would help our hearts to hear. And excuse me, Lord, we just thank you in advance for all that you're about to do. God, we pray these things in your son's name, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, it truly is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Gosh, you just have this list of awesome credentials. And it is pretty amazing, and we're grateful to have him. He is a professor and endowed chair in psychology at Wheaton College, where he runs the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute. He is a clinical psychologist specializing in religious identity and sexual and gender identity conflicts. He assists people in navigating the complex relationships between their sexual or gender identity and Christian faith. He is an award-winning teacher and researcher and is the past recipient of the Gary Collins Award for Excellence in Christian Counseling. He has published over 80 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. He is the author or co-author of several books, including Understanding Sexual Identity, a resource for youth ministers and understanding gender dysphoria, and navigating transgender issues in a changing culture. And his latest book, which you can get soon, is When Children Come Out, among many others. Mark, on a personal note, we just want to thank you for being there for the parents that we have sent you. We know this is a difficult, messy subject, and parents really need to hear from someone who has researched this. And we're just grateful for your assessments and counseling that you've given and helped so many families.
Countless.
So with that, I am delighted to welcome our good friend, Mark Yarhouse.
Take it away, Mark.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk with parents. And thank you, Greg and Len, for just hosting, and appreciate embracing the journey and what it's meant to so many people. So I'm going to be talking tonight about just kind of walking with parents on the journey. As Lynn mentioned, I direct the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute at Wheaton College. We conduct original research around this question of just the intersection of faith and sexual or gender identity. And no one does this alone. I work with colleagues, fellows of the Institute. As Lynn mentioned, I co-author a lot of things, but I'm part of a team that does a lot of work in this area. And I couldn't do it without the work of other people alongside me. So I'm grateful for them and many students who've now professionals who are been working in this space for a long time. Lynn mentioned a few resources through our institute. We do consultations, particularly gender dysphoria evaluations, pretty regularly for families where they're navigating those issues. Other times we just do parent consultations, but oftentimes one of the pressing issues is determining if a loved one experiences gender dysphoria, or there's co-occurring issues or strain in family relationships, or kind of where do we go from here kind of a question. Those are the many driving questions that sometimes bring people to our clinic. But these are some resources. I also have some ways to keep in touch with me. Also, I wanted to point out at the bottom, if you'd like a PDF of the PowerPoint that I'm going to go through tonight, just go to my website, markyarhouse.com, and it'll be a password protected. First thing that comes up is a password protected post, and just put in the word parents, lowercase, and it'll just pop up for you, and you can download that if that would be helpful to you. Lynn also mentioned a forthcoming resource. The publisher just sent us the cover, so I'm just revealing that to say this is what's going to be available probably late fall, maybe November, December, someplace there. But and I was able to do it with one of our SGI fellows, Dr. Olya Zaporozets. And it's kind of a reflection of a line of research with Christian parents. Some of it analyzed data that was done from other organizations. Some of it was original to surveys that we've done, interviews we've done, a host of dissertations. There's a lot of just projects there. It doesn't sound super interesting. We made it sound interesting in the actual book, but just really admire the range of experiences that parents have had. So I'm going to be kind of showcasing some of that tonight. And I would point out that there is no one family journey. There's no singular journey that I could say, here's what everybody does. So there'll be, I'll kind of map out to you what we see that many parents describe to us, and talk about some of what that's looked like from my standpoint as a psychologist walking with people through really challenging circumstances. But not everything's going to line up with your story, and it wouldn't line up necessarily your story with the next story. Like there's just so much variation in just how people navigate, how families navigate this terrain. So with that sort of just respectful, just realizing we're not everybody's in the same exact place, not exactly the same story. What is shared in common? What are some things that many people face, and what are some thoughts about navigating that terrain? So this first image is just acknowledging on the left-hand side this kind of first time when Christian parents are aware of something they didn't understand was going on. And that can sometimes be through disclosure on the part of their child coming out to them, or it could be discovery that they find out maybe through social media or somebody else told them or something like that. Right there sets in motion a conversation or a series of conversations that can be very different just based on how you find out about it, how you find out what's going on in your child's life. And then you have these kind of parallel journeys. You have the child that you love navigating sexual or gender identity, and that's at the top, while you have parents navigating this terrain after being aware of this now for the first time. So at the top, what I would say is that when I meet with loved ones who are navigating sexual or gender identity, it's a lot of it is, how they make sense of their sexuality, how they make sense of their gender. There's this kind of search for meaning. What does this mean to me that I have these experiences? And so that's its own story for another time for us to talk about, perhaps. But what I want to focus on is the other parallel journey for parents, for you all, and it begins with these common things that we would see. So a lot of times what we focus on are Christian parents' experiences, and so a lot of it is what we call like a worldview response. Like, what is a Christian worldview? Is kind of the sum of the beliefs that you hold about how things work and what things matter to you and things like that. It's kind of this big picture view of the world and life around you. Well, there's a Christian worldview, broadly speaking, that parents react out of, like, whoa, how does this fit with how I've understood the world to be as a Christian? My understanding of who God is in the world, all these different things come up in a worldview. It's kind of a catch-all for just a lot of things that parents respond with at that moment. So there's that piece. And then we also saw a lot of what I would just call ambiguous loss, meaning parents often can't pinpoint exactly where that lands, but it just feels like something's not the way it had been prior to us knowing about this. And it feels like a loss, but it can't quite pin it to anything in particular. So we call it ambiguous. It's kind of out there. And sometimes ambiguous loss is more challenging to navigate than a specific loss, because a specific loss has kind of an object, like, okay, that's the focus. This is a little bit more vague, and sometimes the ambiguity makes it harder. Like, because there's different components to it for different parents. And then emotional distress and situational stressors. So let me walk through each of these a little bit. So I mentioned that a worldview is the sum of assumptions a person holds about what's true And Christians have this kind of distinct worldview that undergirds and organizes their beliefs and values. And so it includes things like what's right and wrong, about sexual behavior, God's provision for them as parents, for their child, for their future. So all of that kind of goes into this worldview response. And if that resonates with you, then that might be sort of, what you first reacted with at that moment. I mentioned ambiguous loss, kind of a free-floating sense of something not being the way a parent thought it would be, kind of a vague sense that it's not really directed at your child or at God or anyone else, or it could land in all of those different places simultaneously. And that's just kind of hard to name, a little bit harder to work through. So I guess if you're in that space tonight and you're feeling like this has been hard for me to work through, I just want you to know that probably gives a name to some of why that might be. And it might be different if there was a specific grief over other sets of life events that might be different than this kind of experience. And then I mentioned emotional distress. They say don't put too many words on a slide, but I made a mistake here. But this is early in parents first being aware of their child coming out to them. But common feelings would be, what about the safety of my child? What about how other people might mistreat them? What about social consequences, either broadly or in our circle as a Christian family, going to a local church, something like that? What about prejudice? What about them being harassed? And I think because it may not be tied to anything that's happened at this moment, it's a lot of fear about anticipation of those things. That distress kind of carries into the future a little bit, like what could happen. And then, wanting their child, what does this mean that my child wouldn't have children? Does that mean that I'm not going to have grandchildren? There's those pieces that, again, a lot of this can focus a little bit far afield. Like this is several chapters later in the book, but we're in this chapter right now. So one of the things that's been really helpful to a lot of parents is to stay in the chapter they're in rather than to read ahead or try to get ahead. I think sometimes when parents have read ahead, it's not necessarily where the book's going to go. The great thing about reading ahead in an actual book is it is where the author takes you, but you don't know at this point where things are going to be then. And so reading ahead in our anxiety and worry and fears probably brings a lot more to our plate that we have to carry than we know will happen. We just don't know at this point. But this is a pretty common response. A lot of parents struggle with blaming themselves. They, unfortunately, in some cases, they go to other resources, sometimes Christian resources, and they may pick up this idea that they somehow caused their child to be transgender or they caused their child to be gay. And just as a researcher in this area, I would say that we just don't have that kind of evidence that there's anything that a parent does or fails to do that sets a child on this course of experiencing same-sex sexuality or a different gender identity than the one that would frequently correspond with their biological sex. And so a lot of times my work is helping parents understand that they haven't done something, to not blame themselves, or that they haven't failed to do something, because sometimes they're hearing it even from other Christians in leadership that maybe that kind of implicates the parents. There a lot of fear that their child would lose their faith. What about the conflict between the LGBTQ community, kind of the mainstream of that community, and the church or the denomination that they're a part of? Is that going to just create a tension that doesn't get us anywhere? About the tension between their love for their child and their own religious beliefs and values, not wanting to let God down, which becomes a huge burden to carry as a parent. Let me just give you a couple examples of this. This parent said it was very painful. I was hurt tremendously. Everything that I had read blames the father for their child being LGBT. So I was feeling incredible amount of guilt, like a complete failure as a father. All those things were running through my mind. I wanted to know if he was ever abused as a kid, or if I had caused this, had I been neglectful of him or abusive to him in some way. I was really concerned as to what caused his homosexuality. And, you know, parents aren't alone in this question. If you read, you know, just in scripture, John 9, the disciples, you know, they go to Jesus about a man who's born blind, and they say, who sinned that this person's blind? Is it him, or was it his parents? And that was a very common way for people in that time of Jesus to think about experiences, in this case, like blindness. And they would say it must be the person, or it must be their parents. And I guess I would just bring that up to say we're not that far removed from the disciples. Like, you know, we sort of sometimes are right there. So I would say two things there. It's not willful disobedience that a loved one experiences same-sex sexuality or a discordant gender identity. They find themselves with these experiences. And it's also not that the parents have done something or failed to do something, but this is a good example, very common example of a challenge that parents face. And I mentioned a spiritual struggle. This parent said, I love him and I support him and I won't stop doing so. But at the same time, if I do that, am I being disloyal to God? I really struggled with that. And I continue to a bit. I didn't know how to reconcile my faith, not knowing what God wanted and my love for my kid. That has been the hardest thing for me. And so if you're a parent tonight thinking, you know, that I'm in that space where I just don't know how to do this in a way that pleases God, pleases the love I have for my child, that there are many other parents who've been wrestling with those very same questions, those spiritual struggles. And I'll come back to some thoughts on ways to move forward with those, but just want to lay the groundwork here. And I mentioned situational stressors. These are unique situations that just vary from parent to parent. So you never want to really compare your journey to another parent's journey. They're so unique. You know, but situational stressor would be like if your loved one came out to you as gay versus their loved one came out to you as gay and now is introducing you to their partner, right? Those are two different situational stressors. Or your loved one shared that they're transgender or they experienced gender dysphoria, or your loved one came to you and said, and I was hoping that we could get on testosterone next month. I mean, those are two different situational stressors. So we don't compare, but we recognize for your journey, what are the stressors that I'm facing that are unique to the story that I'm facing. So when you go back to our little diagram here, you have those worldview response, the loss, the potential distress, situational stressors. What will the relationship look like over time is the question. And so I can't predict that. I don't know. Every story is unique. But let me walk through this image of what we're seeing. What we're seeing is kind of this basic roadmap that might be helpful to you. The first thing we would see is there tends to be an increase in a couple of areas that get better over time. They escalate a bit, and then they come down over time. So the two areas I'm going to highlight would be conflict and then anger. So conflict would be, you know, tensions in that relationship that maybe hadn't been there, or if there were tensions before, this doesn't make tensions easier. This kind of exacerbates existing, you know, tensions that might have been there. And then anger is kind of an umbrella term. It's an umbrella emotion for a lot of feelings that are underneath it, like things like confusion can sort of fit under the umbrella of and be expressed as anger, sometimes because we're socialized to express some things, especially men, maybe more than women, as anger. We're upset about something when it's really we're confused about something or we're sad about something. It kind of depends. So that's a bit of an umbrella. So again, these kind of spike and then they come down over time. Now, the over time may be over several years. It might be several months. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be, you know, by the weekend, right? So it's going to be a while. So here's a couple of examples of this. This parent said, oh my gosh, it was very tumultuous. I could never seem to say the right things. She was always angry at me. We were both hurt. She would say stuff to hurt me. Of course, I thought I was always right. We were just hurting each other. It was not good. And you could sort of tell this is a parent looking back over several years and sort of realizing, you know, I contributed to that. We both did stuff. I think that you might find that over time as you are in further chapters, looking back on earlier chapters, you might say, gosh, that plot thickened right here, and here's what happened, and here's what I did, and here's what she did. That might not be an uncommon experience. Here's anger. This parent said there was anger of feeling like our daughter betrayed us from all that we brought her up in through her years, that she would turn to this. It was a lot of emotional roller coaster, not knowing what to do or how to handle it. We couldn't even really stand to be around each other for a while. That's a hard thing to read, but if you're reading that and saying that's kind of where we are, please know that this is a spike that you can sort of anticipate, but we're seeing that it tends to improve over time. For most families, it tends to come down a bit with a couple things that I'll talk about. There's also a number of things that decrease initially and then increase over time. So conflict and anger increased initially and came down. These other things like emotional closeness, communication, engagement, sense of authenticity in our relationship, acceptance, they decrease initially, and then it takes time for them to sort of be revisited, reinstated in the relationship. So what are examples of that? This is decreased emotional closeness. A parent said, that was the worst my relationship had ever been with my son. As a mom, I knew he was lying. I knew that things were not adding up. You know in your gut as a mom, when he says he's somewhere and he's not, we just knew it. This kid that never lied in his life, so transparent, was lying. So our relationship started drifting further and further apart. This kid who was very demonstrative and touchy-feely started pushing away from everyone, even his sister, who he's extremely close to now. During that phase, it was as if he was trying to get away. It was very, very difficult. So you can see in this, they're looking back on it, right? Looking back today as they were interviewed, there was a time when emotional closeness dipped, and then it's gotten better. You can see that even with the closeness to his sibling. Or increased authenticity. This parent said, I would say my son's sexuality doesn't matter anymore. I can't come up with the words, but over these 8 years, it's evolved from being guarded the first couple of years and not wanting to talk a lot about it, to talking more about it, to it's just part of everyday conversation. When he talks about wanting to date, going back to 8 years ago, it was like, I thought, date guys? With a big question mark after it. Now it's me asking him, hey, you dating anybody? And actually wanting him to have a relationship. It's changed on an emotional level. It's changed on an intellectual level. Now this is a good example where parents could be in really different places with something like that. So I'm not laying this out as kind of like a milestone that parents should get to in terms of their acceptance of X, Y, and Z. I'm just saying different parents are in different places on this journey. And for some parents, this reflected increased authenticity to be able to talk about something that before was really triggering to the parent and caused a lot more internal turmoil. So this was what we described as increased authenticity. So I'm going to do a couple of these your turn moments in this talk, just for you to maybe jot down in your journal, take notes on maybe for yourself. But parents that were interviewed offered 2 pieces of advice with all of these kind of changes I've just described, the anger and conflict that comes down, the closeness and authenticity that goes down and comes back up. Keep as many doors open as possible, they said, and stay focused on the most important things. So I would just invite you to reflect on these 2 recommendations from other Christian parents who've been on this journey as well. What they would say to you, just to reflect on their recommendations and to what extent that resonates for you in your own sort of, I'm a kind of journaling psychologist. I invite the people I work with to journal a lot because so much can be done in our time together, but so much more can happen between the time we meet together. So journaling sort of gives you a way to process that and pray about things and engage with others. So keep as many doors open as possible to the relationship, recognizing that as challenging as things are today, over time, things tend to improve in the ways that we've been able to measure. I could actually show you, average rates of closeness and authenticity and conflict. And I could show you how they were higher before the disclosure, they were lower, and then they got better later. So we're interviewing people over here. They're telling us about when they first found out about it. I'm sorry, before they first found out about it, and they're telling us about it when they found out about it, and they're telling us about it now. So there's this interesting sort of dip for those areas, and then anger and conflict kind of this way. So invite you to reflect a little bit on that for your own journey. I would also say that parents at this stage also have two sort of main tasks. One is seeking help. And that's kind of what you've done by reaching out to Embracing the Journey, meeting in small groups, talking with people who have been through similar experiences, maybe getting an evaluation for gender dysphoria, whatever it would be, you're seeking help. What do I read? What podcast do I listen to? Who do I talk to about this? And then the other was maintaining the relationship. How do I maintain the relationship while this is all going on? While I'm trying to figure out and get my bearings. Those are kind of the two fundamental tasks that we saw Christian parents doing at this point. Sometimes people will ask us, when should we seek counseling? When is it sort of beyond the close group of friends that I have? Here's a couple things that I would look at. Consider the toll the journey's taken on you. How are you functioning day to day? Sometimes we would look at just day-to-day functioning. How's your sleep? How's your eating? How's your exercise? These are three basic things that most mental health and medical providers would first ask about, because they're good indicators of just how you're kind of doing. But then, is it affecting you at work? Is it affecting you in social relationships, church, things like that? If it starts to take a toll on areas that are important to you of significant functioning, that's usually a time to talk with someone. Do you need an emotionally safe place to share and process your fears and concerns so they just don't come out sideways? Sometimes parents will talk about, I have all these things that I'm worried about or things that I'm anticipating, and I wish that I could have had a better exchange with my child in the morning as we were getting breakfast together, but it's almost like things came out sideways in a less helpful way, because I was over here stirred up about these things that haven't even happened yet. They're 3-4 years down the road. I'm so stirred up I can't even get my oatmeal working with my child, and I'm over here having this conflict. Things are coming out sideways. So things like that might be good to have a release valve, someone to talk to, so it doesn't come out sideways. Has communication broken down so you're unable to share and listen as you did before? Sometimes it helps maybe just to meet with a third person in the room or a fourth person in the room who doesn't have skin in the game, who can kind of hear what's going on and not be quite as emotionally reactive as things are right now in the home. That might be a good indicator. Perhaps as a couple, if you find that you and your spouse are reacting differently to your child, it can be really easy to become polarized. And polarized means when people have ambivalent emotions, meaning two contrasting emotions they have at the same time, like love and protectiveness for my child and confusion and anger for the circumstances. When those coexist, that ambivalence can lead two people to become polarized. In other words, one person will almost become a caricature of the love and protection, while the other spouse will become a caricature of the confusion or anger and frustration with the circumstances. And they become extreme. And so sometimes I'll say to the person who's more angry and conflicted, I know that you love your daughter, but right now I don't think she or me, I don't think we're seeing that right now. And I want to invite that to come more to the foreground. But it's going to require the spouse who's love and protective to sort of talk about their concerns and their worries, because they're not giving that a voice. So this person is kind of over, compensating for it over here in this way that feels polarized. So that could be worth talking to a third person about. And then finally, obviously, if anyone in the home does not feel physically or emotionally safe because of what's being done or said, by all means, we recommend you seek counseling just to help with safety concerns. This is a population that is at greater risk for self-harm, even suicidal ideation and actions, and then homelessness as well. So those are areas that we really want to step in and make sure that people are safe and there's not things happening that could escalate to things that would be really regretful later. And then this next part is coming to terms with reality. So what do I mean by that? This is really kind of landing on the reality that my loved one is gay or is same-sex attracted or is transgender or non-binary, whatever it would be. Just the idea, what I mean by that is a lot of times parents it's not uncommon for parents to see this as maybe a phase that their loved one's going through. Maybe they're exploring things, and in that exploration, they'll sort of drop it, or it'll just kind of resolve. It'll kind of go away. I'm not saying that's never happened, but most times it's not what is happening, at least for the people who come to see me. In most cases, there's a time where it's like, okay, we've been aware of this now for several months or longer. And there's a point where you sort of come to terms with the reality that what my child said to me is what is happening. And so that's at three different levels. So it's kind of like, this is the new normal. There was before we knew, and there is now. And a lot of times people break up the story of their life, their parenting, their family, their book into those 2 chapters at least. And so I would think of these in 3 different ways, how people change in these ways. Cognitive is like how you think. So how you think about your circumstances changes as you come to terms with this reality. Parents make adjustments here over time. They move from being confused about what has been said to insight about what has been said. Now they start to give meaning to it. So this is what this means. This is what's going on. That way of making meaning out of something, moving from this is confusing, I'm reactive to this, to I now have insight into what is going on, is the key change in how parents think. And that's usually, I kind of measure that by self-talk, how the parent talks to themselves about things. So what I mean by that is sometimes parents come in and a lot of the self-talk is self-blame. What did I do? Should we have been around? Should we have not taken that job? Should we have not let her be in that sport? All kinds of things that parents get concerned about. And now it moves towards things like, people don't know why sexual orientation develops the way that it does. But you know what? I don't know that we have to know. What we have to know now is, how do we love our daughter in this moment? That kind of self-talk would tell me they've come to terms with this reality versus exploring all those possibilities. Well, if we should have done this, we could have done this differently, we should have stopped this from happening. All of that sort of tells me they're not really coming to terms with what's in front of them. They're sort of living in this place of, if we could have solved that puzzle, we would never be where we are today. And so we actually don't know what causes people to have different sexual orientations, including heterosexual orientations. So I can say with confidence that when we start pointing fingers at certain things that we did or failed to do, those have not been shown to be the things that cause sexual orientation, if you will. So I measure that by how a parent is talking to themselves. Another would be emotional changes. These are emotional adjustments that happen over time. They are adjustments to reduce conflict and negative emotional experiences, and also growth in positive emotional experiences like love for your child, emotional closeness, engagement, experience of authenticity. Some of the things that I was describing, that they go down initially, but they get better over time. As they get better, there's kind of a corresponding kind of acceptance of this reality versus that ambiguous loss, that sense of grief, that working through those things. I'm not saying that it would never come back in sort of cycles, like, certain anniversaries, certain experiences might bring things back to you. You're out with your friends, they're talking about their children. Now it's 5 years after your daughter has come out, but they're talking about their children in ways that strikes a chord with you, and it sort of hurts. I'm not saying because it hurts, you haven't accepted or come to terms with this reality, because sometimes that's just kind of a cyclical, it comes back at certain moments and it's kind of, you're not really prepared for it and it kind of hits you. That happens. That's not an indictment on anything. That's just, it's the nature of navigating this terrain. It can be difficult, and some things will make an impression on you as you maybe make comparisons to others and their children and how they're doing and all those types of things. That is a very common experience for parents. it can sort of lead parents to kind of pull back from those potential resources in their life. So I want to try to come back to that as well. And then this other of the three changes was spiritual changes, facing circumstances that, you don't have control over. It often causes a person to develop greater dependency on God. So that might happen. There might be a depth of faith that grows over time because there's kind of nowhere else to turn. There's nothing but a dependency on God. And that might not be where you are tonight. You might be in a very different place. God might feel very distant, very removed, or you have a lot of questions for God. How does this happen in God's providence? There's all kinds of ways that could be framed. But we did see parents telling us, I had to depend on God. I had no other options. I pulled back from people who bore his name. I found Christians to be difficult to talk to. I found them going on about the successes of their families and their kids and these different experiences. And I wasn't prepared for that conversation. I didn't want to go in the narthex anymore. I didn't want to be part of that small group. But you know who I did lean on? I leaned on God. That sometimes we would hear things like that. Over time, a greater capacity for trusting in God and just hope when they do not know or understand the future. So hope for Christians is the expectation that good will prevail. And good is thought of for Christians as the nature of God's character. So hope is the expectation that good, which is the nature of God's character, will prevail. So that's kind of what we were seeing here. And these also inform kind of next steps. Now that I've come to terms with this, what does this mean for me and for my relationship with my child, my relationship with God? And then there may still be important spiritual questions that parents ask. So it's not like they're resolved. This is just some significant shifts that occur that tell us the parent has sort of come to terms with this as a reality in their life. That's really what I'm saying. So let me go back to your turn. Keep in mind that you may be at an early chapter in this story. Coming to terms may not resonate with you at the moment. You may be like, that is not what I signed up for right now. For others, you may be able to recall when that phrase would have first made sense to you. When did you first really absorb what is being said? Give yourself time and space to think this week about where you are with ways in which your relationship has changed. Thinking about what increased initially and came down, what was kind of lost, it seemed like for a season, and might be on the way up. Kind of maybe locate. If you were to say, Mark, I see the journey you're describing, you might kind of locate yourself in that as best you can. Again, it's not perfect, not a template I would lay on top of every family, but what resonates with you there? And then would you be able to identify ways of thinking, emotional reactions, and even aspects of a spiritual journey that might tell you kind of where you are with just coming to terms with this new normal? The last thing I was going to talk about here is just the idea of protectiveness. This is kind of an interesting thing that may surprise no one as a parent, but what we found was that many parents move from having their own questions about their son or their daughter to making sure that others treat their son or daughter fairly and with respect. It's kind of like, I can say these things to my child. I can raise these questions. I can sort of feel conflicted here, but if I see other people mistreating them, I'm still going to step up and protect them. I still want them to be treated with respect. I don't want them losing a job over what they shared. I don't want them kicked out of this experience or lose this opportunity because of the things that they've shared. I may have my own questions about it, my own ambivalence. I'm kind of working this through with them, but I don't want this kind of theater of things going on around me to happen. I want to be able to protect my child. So that was an interesting thing as well. And then this is a little bit of a sidebar here, but how does a parent's faith change over time? And this goes to Christian parents' spiritual journey. I kind of hinted at this, that there's that place where just coming to terms with this reality, this new normal, we do see some spiritual changes toward that end, but we saw a lot in prayer, scripture, trust in God, and then kind of mixed experiences with faith communities. But here's a good quote from the spiritual journey. This person says, "At first, I was very angry at God because I thought, Lord, what else do you expect me to go through? I don't think I can handle this. I don't think I can go through this on top of everything else." I felt so devastated and angry with God that he would do that. At the same time, even in my anger, I still trusted the Lord to take me through it. I usually run to the word and to the Lord when I'm hurting, even though I may be angry with him or don't understand. So I just kept praying and asking the Lord that maybe there would be a change in my son. As I have become more and more educated, I know it's in God's hands. There are a lot of ways that God handles this with different people. And then I mentioned a few specific things that people talked about. Parents talked about prayer. My faith has probably gotten stronger. Believe it or not, faith was something that I've relied on in the past through trying situations, deaths, major issues, and things that have come up in my life. Again, I turned to that to the best of my extent and prayed. I hear lots of people talking about prayer and what it is and what it's not. I think prayer needs to be as much, if not more, listening than conversation. So I've gotten to shut up and listen. I did some prayer and I said, I don't have the answers to this. Let me just listen to you, God, and seek direction in this. It has really helped me mature in my faith in a phenomenal way. A lot of people talked about scripture. It was uncommon. It was not uncommon for Christian parents to spend time in the Word. For some, just reading the Bible was a spiritual discipline, along with prayer. Corporate worship served as a lifeline during just a really tumultuous season. And then trust in God. This parent said, we had some great milestone faith moments together. So even though I really did not understand, and it's painful as a parent in those moments, I chose to trust God with her. I don't know where I got this phrase. Maybe I read it, but I started reminding myself that this is not the end of the story. It was just where we were right then. I had to keep reminding myself that God has a great future in store for her. I had to keep immersing myself in trusting God with my daughter. My daughter chose Christ at a young age. She was baptized. This was not the whole story. This was just a part of the story. And then faith community. Faith communities are complicated. It might be why you're part of embracing the journey, is sometimes local faith communities can not always feel emotionally and spiritually safe. And so finding sort of parachurch organizations, ministries, groups that meet together is a way to be more authentic and more real and ask questions that might be harder to ask in the church. For about a year, this last year, my wife and I were leading a home group through our church for LGBTQ people or their families. And we did have sometimes family members be a part of that. And, you know, for some people, this was as close as they could get to the local church. It was hard to be in the local church for a season. And there is a unique subcultural, Christian subcultural shame that some parents struggle with because of that thought that maybe parents caused this, you know, which I've said that's not happening. But that makes it hard to be forthcoming about the actual experiences of your family life. So here's a person who said, I continued to go to church. My daughter and I found another church together that we went to. It's a really good church and I still attend. I couldn't wait to go. I was excited about going to church for the first time in a long time. I joined a Bible study and I asked everybody that I knew to pray for me and for my daughter. Now, this is a little bit of an outlier. Most Christian parents stayed in the church that they were in. They didn't change churches in the studies that we've done, but families might change churches. And this is an example where they chose to go to a church that they could both attend. Others stayed in the church that they were in to differing degrees, talked about it. I would say parents' experiences in church are interpersonally mediated. The relationships that you have make or break your being in that faith community. And so that's been a pretty consistent finding. So let me close with one last your turn. So how has your local faith community been a resource to you? And if it's not been as much of a resource as you had hoped, how would you like to respond to that as kind of a deficit? Like that's not the way it's supposed to be. how and where will you meet some of your needs for local Christian fellowship and support? What's that going to look like? It could be through embracing the journey. I hope it is. It could be through other means, but what's that going to look like? Because those needs are still there. And maybe it's asking for what you need where you are. Maybe it's finding a place where those needs can be met. Maybe it's through the existing small group supports that you have already. So we just want to encourage you in that your spiritual journey matters. It's important. No matter where you are in that, what questions you have right now, I just would commend to you having some people with whom you can share the journey. You can invite into this that you trust, that are emotionally safe for you and spiritually safe for you, to be transparent about what you're navigating in life. All right, with that, I am going to turn it over to some of the questions that might be coming up.
Mark, thank you so much. That's there's some really, really good learning in there. It's super helpful to the way that you've explained how parents are responding in different ways. Just one of the things that just immediately went through my mind before we start asking questions, I have a question myself. Of the people that you surveyed, what portion of them had received counsel from you or your team prior to that?
Oh, with these surveys, these were more research projects. So these are not people who came to us. They're people who are navigating this in all parts of the United States, trying to figure this out.
Got it.
Yeah.
Good. Well, Kat, would you like to get us going with the first question?
Sure. Our first question that came in is asking, can you expand on the apparent link between ASD and gender dysphoria? And has there been any studies that are shedding light on this connection?
Yeah, great question. So ASD is autism spectrum disorder, and then gender dysphoria is the experience of distress that can be associated at times with a discordance or a lack of congruence between a person's gender identity and their biological sex, usually biological markers like chromosomes, gonads, genitalia. So there is a relationship between the two that we really don't understand. It's been noted in a number of gender clinics throughout the United States and other countries. And I think as WPATH is looking at putting their standards of care, WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, houses what used to be called the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care for transgender care. And it looks to me like they are going to be adding more information on that relationship and the importance of screening for it. Just concerned that you don't want to land on a false positive of diagnosing gender dysphoria when someone is sort of fixated on some things, and that tendency could land on gender related issues. At the same time, you don't want to fail to diagnose gender dysphoria if it's really there and they also have ASD. But right now, I would land with the professionals who say we don't understand the relationship between the two other than it exists. So that I haven't seen new research that I could point to say, here's what that means. We don't know that at this point, but you're right that there's a relationship, and it's what we're being encouraged to do is to screen and assess more carefully for that on the front end so that that's teased out better than just kind of blindly moving things along.
All right, from a listener in California, my 19-year-old trans child, male to female, has been asked by an affirming sister to be a bridesmaid at her wedding. How do we navigate this as parents? We are working hard to maintain a relationship with our child, but are anxious about the dynamics with judgmental or rejecting family members. This issue has already caused so much divide.
So it's the wish of the bride to have her sister be a bridesmaid?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that I could give specific advice for this situation without knowing a lot more of the details. The reason I clarified that is some people would come into that with the bride kind of gets what the bride asks for on their wedding day. It's their wedding day. So there's a little bit of that in probably my background. I don't know that that's a check for anything, but it's sort of the way I think there would be maybe a little more latitude and understanding given the wishes of a bride. But I know that that's a very complicated family and extended family dynamic that could detract or take away from the joy of the day. Well, what's particularly hard though is if the joy of the day is measured by how the bride wants the day to go, and that's a request that the bride wants to do, then that becomes I guess the point of tension. I would say if a family were to move forward with, that's what our daughter wants, and we're going to try to make that happen, that I would encourage maybe parents to think about ways that they would be able to that for other people in advance, so that it could minimize the points of tension of the day. And that's all with permission of everybody else who's involved, but just being able to say, here's why, and this is the posture we're taking. I often do that with parents just in principle. So again, I'm not know exactly what's going on in this situation, not giving direct advice on what to do. But I often say to parents who say to me, extended family will never understand, or so-and-so, this will be a nightmare for them, or this could have this impact on them, is as you figure out the posture you're going to take towards your loved one, and as they're making decisions about how they present, or maybe a social transition, or different things that are on the table, with their permission, it might be good for you as parents to kind of set the frame for extended family, so that they understand what's happening and why, and that you've been in the trenches navigating this, praying over this, engaging around this, and you've landed here. There's a little bit of a boundary that the parents can help hold with extended family to kind of set expectations, rather than have the child have to do that with everybody around them, if it's possible. That's a general principle I tend to follow. There's exceptions, but that's the general approach I take.
All right, the next question is from a listener in Illinois. We discovered that our daughter is bisexual. She puts bisexual flags everywhere, broadcasting it to friends, but refuses to talk to us about it. Any suggestions to getting to a conversation?
Yeah, that's a tough one to know where to start with something like that. So a lot of times what I would look at is there general communication between parents and their teenager anyway? Take bisexuality off the table. What's the quality of our communication on other things in life? And if we could honestly say we have a really good relationship where we communicate about a lot of things, that's a different next step than if you were to say, we don't have great communication, there's not been a lot of goodwill, there's not been a lot of trust, and now this. So why I would do that is the first one, where there's just really good communication, and this really stands out as an outlier, like, wow, why are we not able to go there, is there's something about this topic uniquely that is maybe a fear that if we went there, it would derail all the good we have in our communication. What I often find, because I'm a psychologist, so people come to me in distress. So I don't get a sample of people that represents, the general group of parents that we're talking to. I get people who are like coming in to see a psychologist. So a little bit more strain, a little bit more stress, is that it may be we just don't have really good history of communication over a lot of topics. And now you take one of the most difficult topics and add that to it. So maybe I would back up and say, how do we foster better communication over less stressful topics? Let's talk about, maybe make a hierarchy, a list of topics that we could talk with our daughter about. And bisexuality is one of the highest, most difficult ones. Well, what's a few notches below that? If we made a list of like a dozen things, well, what would be like down at 1 or 2 or 3 that we could work on to get some momentum and trust and goodwill, and then work our way up to something, even if it's really important and we really want to get to number 11 or 12, starting there, if we don't have that history and don't have maybe the communication skills, or she doesn't, or we don't together, maybe that's a place to begin. I might do something like that.
It's good.
All right, we have a listener from New Zealand who has kind of a long question, but I'll try to read through it. My 16-year-old daughter came out as non-binary about a year ago. 6 months ago, she said she didn't mind which pronouns or name I called her, but just this week, she is demanding that I use they, them pronouns and to call her Art instead of her birth name, Sophia. She has told me if I can't, I won't have a future relationship with her. I absolutely don't know what to do. On the one hand, I desperately want to keep a healthy relationship with her. And on the other, I don't want to speak what I believe to be biblical untruth to her and potentially push or enable her further down this path. Any suggestions would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you for that question. So, I think the things that strike me about that is that there was a time when it didn't matter, and then there was a time when it did matter. And so I think I'd want to unpack a little bit more what changed. Something changed. And that doesn't have to be an indictment. That doesn't have to be like an investigation or justify to us the request. I think there's a genuine curiosity that something changed over time, that something that seemed benign was hurtful now, and something that didn't seem important became important. And I think I'd want to understand more what changed so that I could better understand the request. I might go there. I might spend some time on that. And then sometimes what families have done where the name piece becomes a real point of tension is they've come up with some compromises on both sides. So maybe, the parents are locked into the name that they gave their child, and the child is locked into the name that they are now asking for. And that becomes kind of, hardened in each position. And sometimes parents with, again, a third party in the room who doesn't have skin in the game, who can kind of talk through these things, who has some experience with this, might be able to suggest, I've known families where they had nicknames for their child growing up that are tied to actual emotional, engagement and love that they delighted in when they were 5 or 6 or, whatever it was. And returning to that nickname for a time can be a bit of a placeholder that won't cause the reactivity of the birth name, but also isn't where the parents feel more conflicted about the requested name. So sometimes something like that feels a little more accessible to everybody. It's a concession for everybody. So this is, as a parent, to realize that's a big ask for our loved one who's now, for whatever changed, now their heart is set on this, and a nickname wouldn't be the same thing. So that would be a loss for them, but it's also a loss for us because we gave them this name for these reasons and we're attached to those, and there's a grief to that. And moving away from that towards even a nickname is a compromise for us. So just that, to me, that feels like a conversation that might be better with a third party in the room to help you navigate that, just given what's changed more abruptly, and understanding that piece, and then understanding if there's a third way that might work for everybody.
Hey, Mark, a question for you. So unfortunately, we know way too many families that wish they got a do-over, right? The parents lost the relationship with their child because the parent drew a line in the sand and said, I will not do this. I will not say that, etc. And we know too many parents who've lost their child. That is, that their child ended their life. And so I know the stats indicate that for a person who wrestles with gender dysphoria, how important it is for them to be called by their preferred pronouns. And so we live in this world daily. We live in this tension where we see that. And we just know so many parents would say, oh my gosh, please, I understand it's difficult for you, but don't blow this, right? I guess what I'm asking is, what's your thought on that? No one wants to live with regret. And if the goal is to love our children well, how do we do that with this whole thing about trying to keep, what's important to us? What's your thought?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly when we look at the most the kinds of experiences that would be heart-wrenching, that would be, loss of life. I mean, that yes, I think parents would look back and say, I wish we had made that decision differently. I think the tension many parents feel is that they don't want to feel like every request is yes, or there's these. I think that's what you're trying to navigate. When is something putting a child at risk for homelessness or for taking their life or something along those lines? So if you look at someone like Caitlin Ryan's research at University of San Francisco, she has a list of she calls accepting behaviors and rejecting behaviors. And the ones that predict homelessness and the risk of taking your life or suicidal ideation, plan, action are the rejecting behaviors. And the rejecting behaviors are things like, physical abuse, verbal abuse. It's like keeping a child from having any friends who support them in this space. Like, I remember meeting with a mother who had gone to a Christian ministry when her son had come out to her, and the first thing they said was, you got to cut ties with all friends who support him in any way in this kind of coming out experience. So she did, and she was calling me because he was suicidal and he ran away from home. And I said, well, what would it mean to revisit that and renegotiate that and give him access to the friends who've been social support? Because you never cut ties with existing social support without having a plan for social support. You just can't sever those ties. So I don't know what this ministry was thinking. It was probably the worst advice I've heard in a while at that moment. And she did that. She was able to get in touch with him. She was able to talk about reinstating those relationships. I don't think she felt manipulated by him. I think that's what a lot of parents would fear. Am I being manipulated by my child to get everything that they want? I think in this case, those friends were literally a lifeline, and reinstating those relationships, thankfully, was able to happen before there were severe consequences. And he was able to get back in the home and all those things. But like, if you look at Caitlin Ryan's research, it's those types of negative rejecting behaviors that put you on a course for potential homelessness or loss of life. And then there's what she called accepting behaviors, and they're more affirmational about being able to talk about certain things and encourage them in certain ways. Those, I think Dr. Ryan would say, are good and important things to do if you can, but they're not the critical variables for the safety planning we're talking about over here. So to navigate that, I probably want to do that with a mental health professional who could sort of help parents walk through, how do we know when something's, when a no is going to put everyone at risk over here, and when something is going to be more like a negotiable thing over here. So that might be worth some more discernment, I think.
Thanks, Barb.
Yeah.
We've got a question from a listener in Georgia. As a therapist, I know one parent was polarized with anger because he had intrusive thoughts about what his son was doing in the bedroom. It disgusted him. How do you help a parent not go there with those thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, there is a whole kind of area of research on just doing thought stopping and recognizing when you're having thoughts and redirecting your thoughts and being involved in other things. sometimes people will journal their thoughts to kind of get them down and sort of not in their mind so much, or they'll occupy their time and interest and emotions with other activities. So, if you find an intrusive thought that's kind of unhelpful, like that one, one approach is to do kind of a structured journal where you identify the circumstances around you that were connected to that thought being intrusive in your life, and then how you reacted to that intrusive thought. And then you can start to identify, should I be in those situations that kind of create that intrusive thought for me? That is one angle of entry. When I have an intrusive thought, can I stop that thought and correct it with a helpful thought that is not shaming of me or shaming of my son, but is a true thing that I can say, and then see how I'm reacting to that emotionally. So it's kind of a structured journal we call a thought record, where you sort of record your thoughts, and not just journaling your thoughts and recording them, but challenging them and responding in more constructive ways, so that you don't shame yourself, you don't shame your son, but you realize there's helpful ways to respond to a thought that sort of is intruding into my life and getting in my way. And I've also done that spiritually with some spiritual exercises where we prayed against some of those thoughts coming in addition to those kind of thought records. So where I was working with a Christian and it was more faith congruent, we got together, we wrote out some prayers that would be that augment their thought record to help them push back some of those thoughts and ask God to be present with them through the Holy Spirit in that moment, so the thoughts wouldn't continue to be intrusive. So there's a couple things that I've done with people that seem to have been helpful.
Very good. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, sorry, I got sidetracked there. Let's see. The next one is from a listener in Wyoming. What would you say to non-affirming family members that think it is a sin to use a transgender person's preferred pronouns, see it as telling a lie?
So in my writing, I tend to use 3 different lenses to describe ways people approach gender issues. And one I called in issue of more integrity, and this sounds like maybe what these extended family members represent, but there's an emphasis on the integrity of male-female differences that God intended at creation. So this group of people rely on the creation stories to say this is what God intended, and adopting a cross-gender or other gender identity goes against the integrity of those male-female differences. And that's often what people rely on who say, I'm not going to use the preferred pronouns because I'm going against the integrity of what God intended for this person. The other 2 lenses, one is a lens of diversity, which is to see variations in gender as something to be celebrated. And that's where the broader culture is going. And my field, psychology, counseling, social work is there as well. But there's another lens that I also see in some areas that I called a disability lens, which might not be a great word for it, but it just means that the experience is more like a non-moral reality that you would respond to more with compassion. So something like hearing loss is not something that you would say is willful disobedience. It's not something you say is a moral concern. It's not something you say the person's doing the wrong thing by giving them a cochlear implant, things like that. Now, within the deaf community, there's disagreement as to whether it's a medical issue or an identity in a culture. That is an ongoing discussion. But kind of an outsider looking in as a Christian, we don't tend to look at those types of steps that way. We think of this as more of a condition to be empathized with. And so sometimes what I can do is the parents or the extended family is sometimes so worried that if I use preferred name and pronouns, I'm moving to the diversity lens and I can't go there. My values won't let me go there. But they don't realize that sometimes the use of preferred names and pronouns is a way of managing dysphoria that's more like a condition that if we continue to use the name and pronouns that sets them off, it's causing their dysphoria to spike. And so they've tried other strategies, like they keep their hair, long if it's a biological male, or they keep their hair short if it's a biological female, or they wear certain clothing, or they avoid, dresses or hyper feminine attire to manage their dysphoria. Well, the use of a name and pronoun is very much the same thing. Other steps would be, more invasive, if you will, hormone treatment, gender confirmation surgeries. Those are not on the table at the moment, but what's on the table is, we're going to try this. I sometimes say to parents, you could try this for a month and just collect data and see if they're doing better, if they're able to get to school, if they're able to function better, if they're able to come down for dinner, be a part of the family. Maybe that would help. And if you do all those steps and they aren't responding to it, then you can talk with them about whether what they'd asked for is producing the kind of results that maybe we had anticipated. So sometimes I don't make everybody commit forever, but I might say, let's collect some data on it for a season of time and just revisit the question. And I might reframe it to that second lens of disability and treat it less as a moral issue and more as a non-moral reality that they could respond to with compassion. That this is almost like, I know if you're listening tonight and you're squarely in the diversity lens, that this won't resonate with you. I understand that. But for some people squarely in the integrity lens, a little bit of a shift towards a more compassionate response can sometimes be really important to that young person trying to figure this out. And it might not be that you're going against the integrity of God's creational intent as much as you're helping someone manage something that's really distressing to them. And that could really bear some fruit in that person's life. So I don't take that off the table. I try to move them gently towards a different lens that might help people have a different angle of entry into supporting this person, rather than doing something that I think they'd experience as kind of antagonistic.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
The next question is from an anonymous listener. And it's interesting, are there any research findings about adopted kids and prevalence with experiencing same-sex attraction or other sexual identity issues?
I'm not familiar with research on adoption being a correlate to later sexual orientation. It's certainly not viewed as a causal pathway to like having maybe attachment issues as a child or something like that, if that's the direction the person's going. But I don't know. I've not looked at research that would cite that correlate, so I couldn't say either way.
Okay, and this is from another anonymous listener. We've been navigating this journey for about 10 years and have moved through most of the stages you described. We have 3 daughters and all 3 have come out as bisexual. What are the odds? I know we don't know the causes of sexual orientation, but I can't help but think there must be some cultural pressures at work here. What would you say?
That's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, three daughters being bisexual would be an unusual, it's not a very common experience in my looking at research and in my experience with clinically. So it's hard to say what might have happened in that situation. What are the unique situation with those 3 girls growing up? So I'd be hesitant to say too much about that. But I do think that most people in our field view female sexuality as more fluid. And so a higher percentage of women who identify as sexual minorities would identify as bisexual. And I think it was the Hunter College poll. This was a few years ago now. I think for females who identified as somewhere in sexual minorities, 2/3 identified as bisexual and 1/3 as lesbian. And it was just the opposite for the males. 2/3 identified as gay and only 1/3 as bisexual, which has led a lot of people to think maybe male sexual orientation is less fluid, or their male sexuality is less fluid. It's a little more fixed in a way, and females might be more fluid. But I don't know that that explains why 3 in 1 family, just the experience of bisexuality broadly. So I think I'd be speculating at that point.
Okay, a question from someone in Georgia. She said, Mark, your approach is very refreshing when it comes to parenting an LGBTQ plus child. We're navigating a trans son relationship. They have a therapist, but we're not sure they are the best at navigating these issues. They were seeing this therapist prior for anxiety and depression prior to coming out. What should we be looking for in a good therapist relationship as they and we navigate this journey together?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually a pretty common kind of concern that parents face, is that sometimes they have a loved one who's been seeing a therapist. They have a good relationship with that therapist. They've seen them for a couple of years for other issues. And then this is on the table. They've come out as LGBTQ, and but the person's not great in this area, or they don't seem to be very knowledgeable in this area. Particularly the transgender gender identity piece, I think, is the one that I see the most, where the counselor just doesn't have a lot of background and training that they can just kind of pick up on it the way they might be able to around sexual identity and same-sex sexuality. I think people get more training in that in graduate school than they do different gender experiences. So part of that's an issue of their training, their just competence. In some cases, you can expand that by doing some good reading, by consulting with other professionals, and you could continue with that person. That I might recommend that. Maybe that person can do it, has the capacity, could be competent, but just doing additional reading, we used to call it, when they're in training, we call it supervision, but when you're not in training anymore, it's consultation. So I get consultation from people, I give consultation to people. People should be open to consultation throughout their careers. And it might be the kind of thing that counselor could, with consultation, continue to see someone and grow the competencies that they didn't get when they were in school around this issue, because the issue has become more salient in the last 8 or 10 years. And so maybe they just didn't have that background. If you're looking for somebody, though, I think I would be looking for someone who is more client-centered, and meaning they don't have an agenda for how the outcome of therapy is going to look for your child. So sometimes the agenda is, I'm going to move the child in this direction because I think their life would be better if the gender dysphoria was resolved and they could sort of live as their birth sex. That's an agenda. And I would be concerned about that level of trying to kind of manipulate that outcome. But I'd also be concerned about someone who just blindly kind of passed them along towards a transition that medically or whatever, without sufficient assessment and time spent on navigating that. And some of the issues that came up in earlier questions, like ASD, co-occurrence of ADHD, co-occurrence of depressive disorder, anxiety disorders. The model that I use is, let's get an accurate diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Let's get an accurate diagnosis of co-occurring concerns that would be common, like depression, anxiety, things like that. Might very well be caused by peer group disapproval or minority stress or whatever it would be. But then let's treat those co-occurring concerns so that the person can see clearly as they make decisions around gender identity. I don't want somebody making significant decisions about interventions around gender identity out of a depressed mood state, right? So you want to sort of elevate the depression, treat that, help them be in a better place as they make decisions. And the language that we used, I was in a American Psychological Association consensus panel that gave input to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration back in 2015. And one of the things that we talked about was helping young people explore gender identity, and to do so without a fixed outcome. And the fixed outcome, the concern was either direction. If the counselor comes to therapy with a fixed outcome in mind, that was a concern to a number of us in the room. And that could go either direction. So the idea of helping them in a more client-centered way explore gender identity was more the direction we thought with adolescents and children. So that's kind of the direction I would go, is maybe they could describe their approach to counseling around gender. Those types of things might be a way to get at that. I know that's a little vague. Well, that was a whole lot of detail, and then the end of it was a little vague, but I think I would probably ask them to talk a little bit about how they navigate those questions around gender. There's some good workbooks out there that I've used in counseling. They might reference that, like going through a workbook or two on gender identity. So things like that, I think I would listen for if I was, talking with someone. What have there been cases that you've worked with where a person hasn't transitioned or has landed in different places with this? One metaphor that I use right now in counseling, I'm sorry, this is such a long answer, but one metaphor I use in counseling, sometimes our field treats gender dysphoria as if you have this diagnosis, then you're on a journey to a mountaintop, which are medical interventions. And so it becomes a mountaintop experience in society, in media, entertainment. And so at peer group, it becomes this expectation that you have this mountaintop experience. And what I've found is if you look at like the 2015, this is the last time it was published, but it should be published again soon. The last US transgender survey, 28,000 transgender adults, reported that only 44% were saying that they used hormone treatment, and only 25% were saying that they used any type of gender confirmation surgery. So I'm not saying that that's not on the table for people. I know people I've worked with who've done both of those types of things, but it goes against the perception that a lot of people have that if I have this diagnosis, if I warrant the diagnosis, then I go towards the mountaintop. So that in the metaphor, what I tend to say is, I'm going to help you find your plateau. And most people plateau someplace short of that mountaintop. And so how do we help you find a plateau? And plateaus could be 6 weeks, they could be 6 months, they could be 6 years, and they may end up experiencing a need for different medical interventions, but we're not there necessarily today. Where we are today is finding the existing plateau that you've been at for a while doesn't seem to be working for you. What would the next plateau look like for you? And we sort of work it that way. That's kind of how I tend to counsel. I don't know that if you asked a counselor that they would come up with something as quite like that, but I have a friend of mine who says her image is the gender train, and that they get on the train and the train ends at what I would call the mountaintop experiences. And so she really teaches against the idea that just because you have this diagnosis doesn't mean you get on the gender train with one stop over here. There are a lot of ways that people explore and figure out gender identity. And so that's, I would listen for a counselor who could talk that way about it rather than a foregone conclusion. That's kind of thing I would listen for.
Mark, thank you so much. I know you can answer questions for the next couple hours, I'm afraid, but we are.
If they're that long, if I keep answering that long, I could, yeah.
and unfortunately, obviously, we can't get to everybody's questions, but it just really speaks to how great the need is, right?
Yeah.
So for the parents, I can't see you, but I know you're shaking your heads. And so we're really hopeful that you got a lot out of Mark's sharing this evening. If you'd like to continue having conversations, if you haven't been, we'd be happy to have you join one of our parent care groups. You can find more about that on our website. Excuse me. I'd like to just take a moment and again, thank you, Mark, for investing time with us. Much appreciated. There's 500 people clapping for you right now.
Thank you. All right.
And to the participants, again, thanks for showing up. Hey, Melanie mentioned it earlier. Tomorrow, you're going to receive a survey. It'll take about 3 minutes to complete. We would love for you to complete it because you're really going to help us provide better services for you in the future. Excuse me. Also, tonight was our first speaker series event. Our second one will come in June. And Dr. David Gushie will be addressing us on that evening. Date still to be announced. And hey, just a brief commercial of sort before we go. We Embracing the Journey, we don't charge for anything that we do, any of our services.
Even tonight.
Yeah, even tonight. So, but if you feel like you've been blessed through the speaker series or through Embracing the Journey, hey, we would love to have you consider making a donation. You can do that on our website. And Lynn, would you close us in prayer?
Absolutely. Heavenly Father, we are just so grateful that you are our God. We are so grateful that you have all the answers. And we don't sometimes need to have all the answers, but we can go to you to find what you want to teach us. And Lord, right now, I just pray for every parent who is listening, to others who might be counselors or in this field of navigating this topic. I pray that you would give them wisdom. I pray that you would give them discernment. And I pray that you would speak to each one's heart in such a way that they could walk away knowing that you have spoke to them. Father, I thank you for Mark's willingness to take time out of his busy schedule. I pray that you would bless him and his family. And Lord, I also want to just pray for encouragement for these parents too, as I know so many questions weren't asked tonight. But I pray, Father, that you would help them in finding answers to those questions that weren't asked tonight. And so we just give you this night and we thank you in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, friends, thanks again. And God bless you and your families. And we hope to see you again in June. Take care.